He was elected to a graduate studentship at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, where he wrote a doctoral dissertation under the direction of H.L.A. Hart on the subject of rules and duties. In 1965, he was elected to a junior research fellowship at Balliol College, and in 1966 completed his doctorate and was granted the D.Phil degree from Oxford. He became a tutorial fellow at St. John's College in 1966 and held that post until his retirement in 2006, when he was appointed to an emeritus research fellowship at St. John's. In 2010, he was elected to an honorary fellowship at the Queen's College in Oxford. He has been a visiting professor at many universities around the world and has an extremely prestigious reputation in his very important field. He is an associate director of the Philosophical Investigations and of Wittgenstein Studies. From 1997 to 2003, he was an associate editor of 20th century philosophers in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. From 1998 to 2003, he was a trustee of the Wittgenstein Papers and member of the Committee of Editors. Since 2003, he's been a member and secretary of the Advisory Committee of Wittgenstein Editors. He's the author of the 4-volume analytical commentary on the Philosophical Investigations, the first 2 volumes co-authored with G.P. Baker, and of Wittgenstein's Place in 20th Century Analytical Philosophy. He has also written and lectured extensively on the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, as well as the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience. More recently, he published books including Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience and History of Cognitive Neuroscience, both co-authored with M.R. Bennett, and Human Nature, the Categorical Framework. It's our pleasure to welcome Professor Hacker to BYU, and we're very pleased to have him speak with us today. The topic, or the title of his lecture is What Neuroscience, Cognitive Neuroscience Can and Cannot Explain. Did I get that close, Professor Hacker?
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be able to address you here, and a delight to be able to visit your splendid university, and I'm very grateful for your hospitality. I came into this subject of the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience almost by accident, but got more and more fascinated with it, especially after I met my Australian colleague Max Bennett, because the subject of neuroscience has become the most prominent of the sciences in the public mind today, and the claims made by neuroscience are often exaggerated and often confused. And it seemed to me worthwhile trying to pin down where confusion lies and where genuine achievement can be seen. The theme of this series of lectures, I understand it is in Scientism, and that provides me with my starting point. By scientism, I understand attempts to extend the natural sciences beyond their proper sphere of explanatory competence, and the use of the methods of the natural sciences to explain phenomena that require other forms of explanation. The result of scientism is bogus explanation and intellectual deception. The scientific achievements of the last 4 centuries transformed our understanding of the world. The natural sciences rid us of theologism, that is, the extension of theology beyond its proper domain of competence, and enabled us to understand the natural world in terms of robust, testable empirical theories and well-confirmed laws of nature. Our scientific understanding of the world is surely among the greatest intellectual achievements of mankind. I come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. Nevertheless, every source of truth must, in the nature of things, also be a source of falsehood. Now, against falsehood simpliciter, the sciences themselves are well equipped to struggle by further experiment and more complex testable hypotheses. However, a source of truth may also be a source of intellectual illusions and conceptual confusions. Against these, the natural sciences are much less well equipped to struggle. For one cannot dispel conceptual confusions by experimental methods. Scientism, the attempt to extend science beyond its proper domain, is one great source of intellectual illusions and conceptual confusions. These can be eradicated only by the methods of conceptual analysis. Of course, whether such analyses are undertaken by scientists themselves, who are on the whole not trained to do the job, or by philosophers who at any rate ought to be trained to do the job, doesn't matter, because the issue is not a trades union dispute. It is rather a dispute concerning different kinds of intellectual investigations, namely empirical and conceptual. The scientific attitude is well exemplified in the following remarks, one by an eminent American philosopher and the other by a well-known British scientist. Wilfrid Sellars, half a century ago, wrote, "In the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what it is that it is, and of what is not that it is not." Unquote. More recently, at the turn of the millennium, Richard Dawkins in Britain wrote, "Science is the only way we know to understand the real world." Unquote. Science, it is thought, gives us the best description of the world, and the methods of natural science give us the best methods of discovering truth about the world. Realization of the explanatory limits of the natural sciences in the empirical domain dawned in the 19th century, the century of rising historicist self-consciousness. For it became evident to many of the German hermeneutical thinkers in the early 19th century, such as Schleiermacher, and to German historicist thinkers of the late 19th century, such as Rickertz and Dilthey, that the methods of investigation into history, culture, and society are not those of the physical sciences. No amount of physics, chemistry, or biology can explain why Hannibal did not attack Rome after the Battle of Cannae, why increasing wealth is accompanied by falling birth rates, let alone why Raphael painted the figure of Democritus in the School of Athens with boots on. But we do actually know the answers to these questions, and I'm happy to supply them afterwards if anybody wants. Similarly, no amount of natural science can explain what the mind is, how the mind is related to the body, or given that I have a mind, a body, and a soul, what it is that has all these things. But we do know the answers to these questions too. In short, the natural sciences are the best way to explain the phenomena of physics, chemistry, and biology. But they're no way to explain the phenomena of history, political economy, culture, and society, let alone to answer the conceptual problems of philosophy. Nor do we turn to science to explain our humdrum daily activities, why you and I are here today together, or why you came by car rather than walked, or why you bought a widget at a shop on the way. These lessons concerning the explanatory limits of the natural sciences have still not been adequately assimilated. Scientists in different scientific disciplines have displayed the hubris of scientism. Their excesses are typically neither silly nor easy to pinpoint. The scientism implicit in the explanatory claims made by competent scientists venturing into domains beyond the reach of natural science can be constrained and curtailed only by detailed and comprehensive argument, not by dogmatic rejection of the unfamiliar or the unwelcome. To show that a putative scientific explanation of a given phenomenon is a form of scientism is not to show that the explanation is false. Indeed, to show that it is false would rightly be a spur to scientists to improve their endeavours and come up with a correct explanation. Rather, it is to show that the putative explanation is, in one way or another, incoherent, that it is logically or conceptually out of order, that the form of explanation offered is inappropriate to the questions being investigated, or that the very question itself is unintelligible. Now, this requires, above all, a philosophical investigation which will show that the bounds of sense are being transgressed. The 21st century promises to be the century of neuroscience. It's constantly in the headlines of the mass media, and its putative results are a persistent subject of journalistic enthusiasm. Now, its true advances in treating diseases of the brain, in neuropharmacology or neurosurgery, are barely heard in the hubbub surrounding cognitive neuroscience. For cognitive neuroscientists equipped with brain scanners and intoxicated by functional magnetic resonance imaging claim to have made the most amazing discoveries. They claim to have shown that the mind is the brain, or at least that the unconscious mind is the brain, or that we have no free will, or that at least the window of opportunity for free action is a mere 150 milliseconds between the time we become aware that the brain's decided to act and the time at which the muscles contract to execute the intended act. That's the claim made, or was made, by Benjamin Libet in California. They claim that the brain thinks, that the brain believes, decides, and that it interprets the information it receives, that the brain knows things and stores what it knows, its memories, in the strengthened synaptic connections of its neurons in the hippocampus. As neuromania grows, some eminent scientists, such as Ramachandran in California, explain aesthetic appreciation by reference to innate neural responses to the hourglass shapes of exaggerated female forms. I shan't bother you with further folly. What I shall try to do in this lecture is to show what kinds of conceptual errors are evident in the writings of some leading neuroscientists. I shall show you that cognitive neuroscientists are commonly conceptually confused in subtle but remediable ways, that the questions they sometimes ask make no sense, that some of the experiments they conduct are incoherent, and that the results of the experiments they conduct sometimes fail to show what they claim to have shown. My aim is not to denigrate neuroscience, rather it is to eradicate conceptual confusions from neuroscience. I believe that there is a very good chance that further developments in neuroscience in the next decades will enable us to alleviate the scourge of Alzheimer's and senile dementia, to cure Parkinson's and to treat schizophrenia. What cognitive neuroscience will not do is solve the problem of the freedom of the will. It has been solved. We are indeed free agents, and the arguments against freedom of the will are fallacious. It will not uncover the mysteries of consciousness. They're only pseudo-mysteries, resting on conceptual muddles and confusion. And cognitive neuroscience will not explain the relationship between the mind and the body, because there is no relation, since the mind is not a relatum. I'm happy to explain that later. These are all philosophical, conceptual questions, not empirical ones. They can no more be solved by neuroscience than mathematical theorems can be solved by experiments in physics, and the analogy is quite an important one. It's a striking fact in the history of ideas that we try to model our understanding of ourselves on the model of our machines. Plato compared the soul to a two-horse chariot and driver, the horses representing the appetites and passions and the charioteer reason. Descartes compared animals with the mechanical automata of his day and argued that they were non-conscious, unthinking biological automata. He thought that the human body too is such a machine, but it is one that is controlled by the mind. He compared the mind or soul with the controller of the flow of water into the wonderfully complex fountains of his time. For, he argued, it determines the flow of animal spirits, which today we'd call neural impulses, via the pineal gland along the nerves to the muscles. When I was a boy, the brain was compared to the central telephone exchange and the mind to the telephone operator at the exchange. Today the brain is compared to a computer, and the mind is held to stand to the brain as the software of a computer to its hardware. The power of these similes is remarkable, and the ensuing confusions are absolutely non-trivial. Richard Dawkins has remarked that, I quote, "Each one of us is a machine, like an airline, only much more complicated." And Colin Blakemore agreed, "We are machines, but machines so wonderfully designed that no one could count it as an insult to be called such a machine," unquote. But of course it is an insult to be called a machine, since machines are not persons. They have no minds, they are under no obligations, and they have no rights. They cannot act for reasons, although there are indeed reasons why they do what they do. And they cannot feel emotions for reasons, since they can't feel emotions at all. And they cannot reason. What they can do, since this is what we've built them to do, is to produce the results of calculations and computations without anyone or anything actually calculating or computing. We are not biological machines. Let me remind you of some salient conceptual differences. Machines are designed, animals and humans are not. Animals and humans have a good and various complex conditions conducive to their welfare. Machines have neither a good nor a welfare, although some conditions may be good for a machine and others bad for it. But what is good for a machine, for example, to be regularly oiled or kept out of the rain, is preventative. That is, it prevents deterioration of the machine in wind and weather, overuse and neglect. But what is good for an animal or human is also augmentative. That is, conducive to an increase in its welfare and well-being. By contrast, what augments the performance of a machine does not increase its welfare but its performance, because machines have no welfare. Machines have controls, animals and humans do not, though they may be controlled in various ways. The purpose of machines is the purpose for which they were designed. Animal species do not exist for a purpose. Animals and humans alike have purposes of their own, which are whatever ends they pursue, but machines do not have ends of their own. Animals and humans are alive. They have a life cycle consisting of characteristic phases. Machines are neither alive nor dead, and having no life, they have no life cycle. Animals and humans can be healthy, may prosper and flourish, or they may sicken, suffer poor health and illness. Machines can be none of these, but only in good or poor working order, break and break down, but unlike us, they do not die. They are neither conscious nor unconscious, but just machines. We need not worry, as science fiction writers and journalists often do, that machines will take over the world. Only worry that governments, with ever more sophisticated machines, may destroy civil liberties and lead us into a dystopic Brave New World. We are indeed creatures with a mind. Inanimate objects and machines don't have a mind. What then of other animals? Crabs and mollusks, fish and fowl, lions and elephants. Well, what sort of question is this? Do non-human animals have minds? Certainly it's not akin to such questions as, do any animals have a body-brain weight ratio larger than so-and-so? Or do animals suffer from Parkinson's disease? Rather, it's more like, do animals have voices? That is, in order to answer such a question, we must first clarify for ourselves, who have both minds and voices, what the grounds and circumstances are that warrant ascribing a mind or a voice to a living human being, to a living being. Now, having a voice is clearly straightforward enough. It's connected with the ability to sing, to accompany music with song, to declaim, hence to control one's voice in speech, modulate it at will, raise and lower it, and so forth. Having a mind, however, is a more complicated matter. The struggles of different cultures to articulate what is distinctive about animate life, breath, hot blood, thumos, psyche, ruach, neshama, became linked with equally difficult endeavours to articulate what's distinctive about human mental life, spirit, ghost, soul, mind. Philosophical reflection on human nature and human powers bifurcated very early in the history of our subject. Aristotle conceived of the mind, the rational psyche, as the array of powers characteristic of rational beings, the powers of intellect and rational will. To have a rational psyche is to have the power to think and act for reasons. Only if one has a rational psyche can one apprehend truths of reason, such as truths of maths and logic, or apprehend truths of morality, the characteristics of the virtues and the differences between right and wrong. If we characterize the mind in analogous terms, we shall further realize that only creatures with a mind have the potentiality for self-consciousness, that is, for reflection on themselves, their deeds, feelings and thoughts, their attitudes, motivations and goals. Furthermore, only if one has a mind can one also have an autobiography or history, a sense of one's past and of one's social identity. And it takes but little further reflection to realize that all these powers are dependent upon mastery of a language. They are essentially powers of language-using creatures. The alternative conception, given philosophical shape above all by Plato and Augustine, and in the early modern era by Descartes, is to conceive of the mind as a distinct entity or substance, connected to, but in principle detachable from the body. Descartes characterized the essence of the mind as thought or consciousness, and surprisingly denied that non-human animals are conscious beings. Rather, he thought they are biological automata, lacking not only reason but also consciousness and thought. Accordingly, for a human being to have a mind intermingled with the body, as Descartes put it, is to think, perceive, feel emotions and desires, and to cause one's body to move in different ways in pursuit of what one desires. Well, Descartes was mistaken about his restriction of consciousness to humans, and his reasons, which I haven't mentioned, were poor. However, his conception of the mind displaced the Aristotelian and medieval one and dominated early modern and modern thought. One of the distinctive features of Cartesian dualist thought is that psychological attributes are ascribed not to the body but to the mind. After all, Descartes would argue, what would the body, which is after all merely extended matter in organized form, what would the mere body do with a mind? This seems as absurd as crediting an automaton with a mind. What could a piece of complicated clockwork do with a mind? No, psychological attributes, he thought, are properties of the mind. It is the mind, not the body, that is conscious or unconscious, that thinks and reasons, that feels sensations and perceives, that knows and remembers, that forms intentions and executes them. Or so it seemed. The development of neuroscience in the 18th and 19th century occurred in the shadow of Descartes. Most of the great neuroscientists prior to the Second World War, including the Newton of neuroscience, Sir Charles Sherrington, were avowed Cartesian dualists. In mid-20th century, partly due to the psychological behaviorism that flourished in the interwar years, and partly due to the philosophical assault on dualism mounted by Wittgenstein and Ryle, the sciences of the brain turned away from dualism. Vaguely aware that there were objections to a duality of mind and body, they turned to what I cannot but deem a degenerate form of monism. The mind, they argued, is not an immaterial substance, it is a material part of the material substance that is the animal. The mind is the brain, and mental attributes that we commonly ascribe to human beings and animals, as when we say that they perceive, want, feel pain or anger, expect or think something to be so, are ultimately to be explained by reference to the brain's feeling pain in the body image that is in it, the brain perceiving, thinking, believing, wanting and deciding. What post-war neuroscientists in effect did was to retain the basic structure of the Cartesian conception of the mind, but replace the ethereal non-matter of the mind by the grey glutinous matter of the brain. That is, the Cartesian conceptions or misconceptions of the relation between mind and body, between mental attributes and bodily behavior, between will and action, were left intact. although it was now the brain in the driving seat rather than the immaterial mind. Let me illustrate this intellectual aberration with a few examples. The Nobel Prize winner, Francis Crick, who got the Nobel Prize for the DNA, Crick argued, what you see is not what is really there, it's what your brain believes is there. Your brain makes the best possible interpretation it can according to its previous experience and limited and ambiguous information provided by your eyes. The brain combines the information and settles on the most plausible interpretation of all these clues taken together, unquote. So seeing is explained by the brain's believing, interpreting, relying on previous experience, and making use of information. Another Nobel laureate, Gerald Edelman, argued that the brain categorizes, discriminates, and, quotes, recursively relates semantic to phonological sequences and then generates syntactic correspondences by treating rules developing in memory as objects for conceptual manipulation. I can't pretend to understand that. Colin Blakemore, an eminent British neuroscientist and sometime head of the Medical Research Council, asserted that, quote, the brain gets its knowledge by a process analogous to the inductive reasoning of the classical scientific method. Neurons present arguments to the brain based on specific features they detect, arguments on which the brain constructs its hypothesis of perception, unquote. So the brain knows things, reasons inductively, and constructs hypotheses. Antonio Damasio holds that our brains decide, and Benjamin Libet concurs that the brain makes decision and initiates action before the human being is even aware of it. What is in effect being done is to ascribe psychological attributes to the brain in order to explain the exercise, or faults in the exercise, of human psychological powers and abilities. This is a widespread incoherence rife in cognitive neuroscience. Let's go back a stage. I said that it was characteristic of the Cartesian conception of the mind that mental attributes were ascribed to the mind, and indeed that seemed a much preferable alternative to ascribing them to the body, which we are inclined to think in our dualist moments the mind has. But that was already a dire error. It isn't my mind that thinks, it is I. It isn't my mind that makes up its mind. Minds don't have a mind to make up. I make up my mind. And it isn't my mind that has a pain in its body image. It's I who have a pain, and it's in my hand or foot, and not in a body image in my mind or in my brain. To call something to mind is to remember, and it's people that remember things, not brains. And to have a thought cross one's mind is for something to occur to one, not for something to occur to one's mind. To be in two minds is to be undecided. And it is not one's mind that is undecided, it is oneself. To have half a mind to do something is to be tempted to do it, and it's not one's mind that's tempted, and so on. All ascriptions of psychological attributes to the mind is either metaphorical or a mere façon de parler. Is human beings not some apparently ethereal, immaterial substance allegedly attached to human bodies that are the subject of mental attributes? To ascribe the same set of psychological or mental attributes to the brain rather than to the mind is not to remedy but only to aggravate the conceptual confusion. It's not false but incoherent to suppose that the brain is the subject of psychological attributes. There is no such thing as a brain's thinking, believing, knowing and remembering, let alone deciding and intending. A fortiori, there can be no such thing as explaining why a human being malfunctions in various strange ways by reference to his brain's knowing or not knowing something. Why is this so? Why should neuroscientists not extend language in this manner? Let me explain. We ascribe psychological attributes to a being on the ground of its behavior. We say that an animal is in pain if it displays characteristic pain behavior. We say of it that it wants something if it displays conative behavior, tries to get something. We say that it's pleased if it displays pleasure when it gets what it wants. as when a dog wags its tail in delight or a cat purrs. We say of human beings that they're thinking when they're evidently engaged in cogitative tasks, playing chess, doing a calculation, arguing a case. We say of humans that they intend doing something if we see them making appropriate plans and preparations, or when they announce their intentions. And we say of others that they hope or fear, love or hate, approve or disapprove, when they display such feelings in what they do and say in the circumstances of life. In all these cases, it is the creature as a whole that is the subject of psychological attributes, since it is the creature as a whole, not part of it, such as the brain, that displays psychological attributes in behavior. Brains, by contrast, do not behave. They don't smile or weep, cry out or groan. There's no such thing as the brain making up its mind, since it doesn't have one. It's human beings that have minds. There's no such thing as a brain thinking or reasoning. There are no reflective or unreflective, thoughtful or thoughtless brains. Only human beings who may or may not reflect on what they're doing, have done or are going to do, who may behave considerately or carelessly and may think before they act or act spontaneously. Now, these are conceptual truths. It's not because it's too difficult for brains to know or remember, think or believe, hope or fear. It is because it makes no sense to ascribe such predicates to brains. The error is one which I have elsewhere termed a mereological fallacy. Mereology is the logic of parts and wholes. The mereological fallacy in neuroscience is the incoherence of ascribing to a part of a creature properties that can intelligibly be ascribed only to the creature as a whole. Of course, a similar mereological fallacy applies to machines too. Aeroplanes can't fly without engines, but it's still the aeroplane that flies, not its engine. Antique bracket clocks would not keep time but for their fusees, but it's the clock, not the fusee, that keeps time. So too, animals and human beings without a brain could do none of the things they characteristically do. They'd be dead. But it is the living creature as a whole that has and exercises psychological powers, not their brains. It is true that we couldn't walk without a brain, but we walk with our legs, not with our brains. We couldn't think and reason without a brain, but it is still we who think and reason, not our brain. So the mind certainly isn't the brain, although we would have no mind had we no brain. What then is the mind, and how is it related to the body? The mind is not a thing of any kind, and precisely because it's not a kind of thing, it's not related to the body in any way. Since the mind is not a kind of entity, the question, what is the mind, is misleading. It is as misleading as the question, what is a sake, that a child might ask when the mother says, do it for my sake, dear. So what is the right question to ask in order to dispel confusion? It is this. What has to be true of a creature for it to be said to have a mind? And the answer is clear. It has to be a creature with a distinctive range of abilities exhibited in its behavior, or that would be so exhibited were the creature not incapacitated. What kind of abilities? Well, not merely consciousness. Most animate beings, from fish to fowl, from lizards to lions, go through a waking and sleeping cycle. That is, they are conscious or unconscious. Is that a reason for saying they have a mind, can reason and think, have an inner life of reflection and imagination, grasp the difference between good and evil? All developed beings have perceptual powers, and so may become and then be conscious of something that catches and holds their attention. But that surely doesn't mean that we should extend the idiom of mind to fish or frogs, or even cats and dogs. We can already say everything we wish to say by characterizing them as sentient beings that can feel pain, want things and pursue goals, that can perceive their environment and become conscious of such features of it as catch and hold their attention. Animality is a necessary condition of having a mind, but not a sufficient one. Many animals have the ability to recognize themselves in a mirror. Scientists have become very excited about this, assuming, quite wrongly I think, that to recognize oneself in a mirror is to be aware of oneself, and that to be aware of oneself is to enjoy a form of self-consciousness. They concluded, equally wrongly in my view, that apes, elephants, dolphins and crows are not merely conscious but also self-conscious creatures. And certainly if an animal has the capacity for self-consciousness, then it has a mind. But this is confused. To be able to recognize oneself in a mirror is not to be able to recognize one's self in a mirror. The ability to recognize one's reflection is not a form of self-consciousness. It is an ability that does not imply any conception of oneself whatsoever, let alone a conception of what or who one is. An animal can, after all, look at itself without a mirror. It doesn't mistake itself for another animal. And it doesn't mistake its foot or paw for the foot or paw of another member of its kind. But that doesn't make it partially self-conscious. The fact that it can recognize more of its somatic features, say its face, in a mirror, is not an increase in self-consciousness, merely increase in intelligent responsiveness to what is visible. So how are we to draw the line between animals that can be said to have a mind and those that can't? Should we follow the Cartesians and the moderns and settle for consciousness? Or should we follow the Aristotelians and restrict ourselves to those beings in possession of the powers of intellect and rational will? I believe that with two provisos we should follow Aristotle. To have a mind is to have the distinctive powers of beings that can reason and think, feel and act for reasons, and that are therefore free agents responsible for their deeds. The two provisos are, first, that we should further recognize that such powers are distinctive only of developed language-using creatures, and secondly, that mastery of the concepts expressed in a developed language suffuses the rest of our animal powers of perception, affection and action, since we cannot but subsume what we perceive, feel and do under these concepts. If having a mind is best conceived as possessing and exercising a range of language-dependent abilities of intellect and rational will, then it is obvious that the thought that the mind is the brain is incoherent. It's like saying that the horsepower of a car is the engine under its bonnet. Neither abilities nor their exercise in the stream of life are objects of any kind, let alone brains. Human beings have a mind, that is, they have a distinctive range of abilities of intellect and will. They would not have those abilities but for their brains, but it is they that have the abilities. It is people, not brains, that can reason and think, know and believe things, want things and try and get them, act intentionally and bear the responsibility for their actions. A human being, a person, is not a brain in a skull. The misunderstandings we're dealing with reach deep. So far I've discussed attempts by neuroscientists to resolve conceptual questions that can be solved only by means of careful conceptual analysis, not by scientific experimentation and empirical theorizing. This, I've emphasized, is a form of scientism. Now I should like to turn to conceptual confusions within empirical neuroscientific research. Sometimes such confusions don't vitiate the research, but only the conclusions drawn from it. In some cases, what looks like an explanation is actually not one at all. In other cases, the misunderstandings render the research worthless, since the question being asked makes no sense. And sometimes the misconceived questions lead again to scientism, for example, to show by empirical means that we lack free will. Let me give you some examples. Eric Kandel received a Nobel Prize for his work on memory. The work was remarkable. Kandel worked on a primitive marine creature known as a pleisia, a sea slug. Its brain has a mere 20,000 neurons, and the cells and axons are very much larger than ours. By touching its gills, a withdrawal reflex is activated. After a number of trials, the gill retraction becomes faster. Microscopic scrutiny of the neurons and axons of the sea slug showed changes at the synapses that were duly analyzed with wonderful precision. The conclusion drawn from this brilliant research was that memories are stored at synaptic connections. What seems questionable here is whether this research has anything whatsoever to do with memory. Kandel held that memory is, I quote, any change in the behavior of an organism consequent upon experience. But that's mistaken, for it would mean that if an animal limps after being wounded, then it's remembering something. Or that if one's reaction to having a puff of air blown in one's eyes leads to faster blinking reactions, that's a manifestation of memory. Well, I wouldn't want you to test my memory in that way. Memory is knowledge retained. A creature remembers something if it previously came to know it, knows it now, and knows it now because it knew it previously. Sea slugs are far too primitive a form of life for the idea of knowledge, let alone memory, to gain any grip whatsoever. What was being tested was a form of reflex behavior, which is not a kind of remembering. Of course, this criticism doesn't imply that remembering does not involve strengthening synaptic connections in some parts of the cortex. Perhaps, for all I know, it does. But even if it does, that does not mean that memories could intelligibly be said to be stored at synaptic connections. One can store knowledge in books, on filing cards and on computers, but not in brains, and certainly not at synapses. To know something is to have a complex and diffuse ability, and since to remember is to retain that ability, it makes no sense to speak of storing an acquired ability to say, do, or think things at a synaptic connection. Nor does it make sense to store a memory, namely what we remember, namely that things are or were thus and so, in the brain. What on earth would it mean to say that one stores that the Second World War ended in 1945 in the brain? It's simply not English. That we can remember the things we learn is doubtless due to changes in the brain, including, I'm sure, changes at synapses, about which we know next to nothing. But it doesn't follow that we store what we remember in the brain. Antonio Damasio argues that when you and I see an object outside ourselves, we form comparable images in our respective brains. Gerald Edelman, another Nobel laureate, holds that, quote, as human beings, we experience primary consciousness as a picture or mental image of ongoing categorized events, unquote. And Francis Crick stated that, quote, we can see how the visual parts of the brain take the picture, the visual field, apart, but we do not yet know how the brain puts it all together to provide our highly organized view of the world, that is, what we see. Kandel and his colleague Robert Wurtz presented what they conceived to be a sore problem. Quote, how is information carried by separate pathways brought together into a coherent visual image? How does the brain construct a perceived world from sensory information, and how does it bring it into consciousness? Unquote. But this too is confused. We do not see images unless we're looking at pictures in the art gallery or watching a film. We see objects and their properties, events, processes, and activities. We see the multicolored world around us, not images in our brains. There are no images in our brains, and if there were, we wouldn't be able to see them, since we can't see anything in our brains. What is true is that the neural responses of the retinae engender neural impulses in the optic nerves that are duly transmitted to various parts of the visual striate cortex, different parts of which are sensitive to different features in the visual field, such as color, line orientation, and motion. We don't yet know how the excitation of the neurons in the columns of the visual striate cortex is linked to neural activities in other parts of the brain, the upshot of which is that we see and acquire knowledge of the visual scene before us. But that is misdescribed as the brain taking apart the visual field, and the consequent problem is mischaracterized by the question, how does the brain construct the perceived world from sensory information? For the brain does no such thing. What it does is to enable the animal to perceive the world. It constructs nothing, neither an image nor a perceived world. It does not put together information, either in the common or garden sense of information, or in the information theoretic sense, which is quite different. The brain is not an information processor, as is a computer. The sensory input to the brain is not information, and the output or upshot of normal brain activity is not information, but the exercise of visual abilities. That is, we see and may thereby acquire visual information. The brain and the perceptual organs endow an animal with the ability to see. The activity of the perceptual organ, in this case the eye, and the neural activity of the brain consequent upon it, is what is empirically requisite for the animal to exercise its sense of sight, which is indeed a source of knowledge and information. Let me turn to a different array of problems discussed by contemporary cognitive neuroscientists, problems pertaining to voluntary and intentional action. It's been suggested by contemporary cognitive neuroscientists in Britain and the USA that far from us being free agents responsible for our deeds and free to lead our lives within the framework of social possibilities, it is our brain that decides things for us. The experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet in the United States and California were as follows. Subjects with their brain activity being recorded were told to move their index finger if they wanted to. If they moved it, they were asked to note on an electronic clock measuring milliseconds exactly when they felt the decision to move their finger, felt the desire or urge to move it, or felt the intention to do so. The time at which they reported such feelings turned out to be 350 milliseconds after the motor center in the brain showed increased activity, and 150 milliseconds before the muscles in the finger contract. From this it was concluded that the brain decides to do things before the agent becomes aware of the decision. And this in turn was supposed to show that the only room for free will was the 150 milliseconds window of opportunity in which the person could stop the brain from acting. It sounds like Alice in Wonderland, but it isn't. This is very confused. Moreover, it is a form of scientism, since it seeks to resolve a conceptual question, whether the will is free, by means of scientific experimentation. First, there's no such thing as feeling a decision or intention. And although one can feel desires, the desires one feels are appetites, such as hunger and thirst, not wanting to move a finger. Secondly, there's no such thing as the brain's deciding anything. It's human beings who decide to act or refrain from acting. And thirdly, there is no such thing as one's brain informing one that it has decided to move one's finger. Fourthly, suppose one does decide to move one's finger and one moves it. Can one pinpoint making this decision to the millisecond? The notion of the time of a decision no more lends itself to such minute determination than the notion of the time of a smile or the time of a thought. Fifthly, it is mistaken to suppose that a voluntary movement is a movement preceded by an act of volition or decision. After all, every word I am now uttering is uttered voluntarily and intentionally, but the words I utter are not preceded by separate acts of deciding to utter them. Sixthly, it's equally mistaken to suppose that when one moves one's finger voluntarily, the movement of one's finger is caused by one's antecedent decision, volition, or felt urge to move it. Note that an urge can cause a voluntary movement. Note that an urge can cause a bodily movement, but then the movement is involuntary, as when the urge to sneeze, cough, or vomit causes one to sneeze, cough, or vomit. So the presuppositions of the experiments involve an incoherent conception of voluntary action. Moreover, the range of experimentation is absurdly narrow. What happens to the motor centers of the brain when one decides now to move one's finger in 30 seconds' time, or when one decides now to go for a walk tomorrow morning? Finally, determination of whether human beings are free and responsible agents is a conceptual matter that demands clarification of what counts as acting of one's own free will. And at least one thing is clear. To act freely is not to be caused to act by the occurrence of a volition or a decision or an intention. Time allows only one further example to demonstrate how conceptual confusion can lead a misconceived description of a problematic and puzzling phenomenon to masquerade as an explanation of that phenomenon. Patients with severe epilepsy can sometimes be relieved of their symptoms by undergoing hemispherectomy, which involves cutting through the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is dominant for language and speech, and the right is largely causally responsible for visual motor tasks. Patients who had undergone hemispherectomy were exposed to a pair of pictures, for example, of a snow-covered house and drive on the left of their visual field, thus affecting the right hemisphere, the contralateral one, and of a chick's claw on the right of their visual field, thus affecting their left hemisphere. They were then asked to pick out 2 further pictures from a strip of 8, which would severally match each of the pair of pictures before them. Patients then pointed with their left hand to a shovel to clear the snow-covered drive, and with their right hand to a chicken's head to match the chicken's claw. When asked why they selected the shovel, instead of saying that it was needed to clear the drive, they confabulated, saying that it was needed to clear out the chicken house. Very bizarre. Gazzaniga and Ledoux explained this curious dissociative and confabulating phenomenon as follows, and I quote, "The left hemisphere interpreter has no knowledge of the snow scene seen by the right hemisphere, and it accordingly makes up a story to explain why the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, pointed at the shovel." From this and other experiments, Gazzaniga concluded, quote, that mind left dealt with the world differently than mind right, unquote. But this is a muddle. The hemispheres of the brain can't be said to have minds. They can't be said to see or to know or be ignorant of anything whatsoever. They can't be said to recognize anything or to make judgments. So this explanation is literally unintelligible. The correct description of the phenomenon is that severing the corpus callosum deprives human beings of their capacity to exercise normally coordinated functions of seeing what's before them, matching objects to one another and explaining the reasons for the match. That is a consequence of the disconnection of the neural fibers that are causally implicated in the exercise of the relevant capacities. In short, the transmission of neural signals across the corpus callosum is a necessary condition for a person to be able to carry out the recognitional, matching and explaining tasks. But of course we knew that from the experiment alone, without any explanation at all. The explanation offered concerning one hemisphere seeing but being unable to inform the other hemisphere, and the other hemisphere making up stories to explain what the contralateral hemisphere is doing with its hand, does no more than re-describe the phenomenon in misplaced anthropomorphic terms, and it actually explains nothing at all. Let me conclude. The examples I've discussed are representative of a widespread style of thinking in cognitive neuroscience. What I believe they show is that successful cognitive neuroscience needs to pay far more attention to conceptual clarity than is customary. Poking the gills of sea slugs is not as such research on memory at all, which should have been evident by more careful reflection on the concept of memory. Equally, more attention has to be dedicated to the design of experiments. Wiggling one's finger is hardly a fruitful field for determination of brain activity associated with voluntary and intentional behavior. Research on the neural correlates of consciousness had better be preceded by far more attention to the purely conceptual question of what consciousness is, that is, what it is to be conscious as opposed to unconscious or non-conscious, and what it is to be conscious of something, as well as what sorts of things one can be conscious of. Unless one is clear about that, as few neuroscientists are, serious research can't even begin. And if one is clear about that, it may well be that the very idea of a neural correlate of consciousness is chimerical, since the phenomena of consciousness are far too heterogeneous and categorically diverse to have a correlate. Neuroscience may aspire to explain what neural structures endow human beings with their distinctive powers, and what neuronal activities accompany the exercise of such powers. More importantly, we may reasonably hope that neuroscientists will discover what forms of neural malfunctioning are responsible for the various appalling and incapacitating diseases of the mind, and how we may strive to cure them or treat them. And these are indeed noble goals. What neuroscience cannot do is resolve conceptual questions such as what is the mind, or are we free? Nor should it aspire to explain free human behavior, a task that belongs to hermeneutics and methods of explanation that are essentially teleological, intentional, and social. Finally, it is surely absurd to try to explain morality and moral experience, or aesthetic value and aesthetic experience in neural terms. For the most that could be discovered are the conditions of the possibility of moral understanding and aesthetic experience. The differences between right and wrong, or between great works of art, good or weak works of art, kitsch and chicanery, are not to be found by studying the brain, but by reflection on society and on the good of man, by studying art and its history. Thank you very much.